Hi there. Thanks for tuning into the Canadian Constitution Foundation's Freedom Update. Today was the second day of the hearings in the Public Order Emergency Commission, which is also known as the Rouleau Commission. This is the legally required public inquiry into the federal government's first ever invocation of the Emergencies Act, which was in response to the 2022 Freedom Convoy. The Commission is examining and assessing the basis for the government's decision to declare an emergency. In this video, I'll give you a quick summary of some of the things that stood out to me in day 2 of these historic hearings. I can't wait to tell you all about it. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Christine and I'm the Litigation Director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in Canada. I upload regular videos about our ongoing cases and about other interesting developments in constitutional law in Canada, so if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please hit like and subscribe below. It really helps my videos out a lot. Also, please remember that my videos are not legal advice. If you have your own legal question or problem, please consult your own lawyer. So today at the Rouleau Commission, there were 6 witnesses that were called, and the way these hearings work is that each day different witnesses are going to be called to give testimony about their area of expertise or experience. They're questioned by the commission lawyers, and then they are cross-examined by lawyers for what are called the parties to the commission. There are 20 different organizations who have been given status as parties, including us at the Canadian Constitution Foundation. There are also other civil liberties organizations like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. There's a party representing Ottawa residents, representing the protest organizers, representing police, and representing different levels of government, including the federal, provincial, and municipal government. Not every party will get to cross-examine each witness. The parties are given a limited amount of time, so they choose how to spend it and on which witnesses. So while we at the CCF are a party to this inquiry, that doesn't mean that we're going to be cross-examining every witness or even doing a cross-examination every day. We pick the witnesses who we think have the most important evidence to make the point that we think is the most important. And for us, the most important part of this whole inquiry is the point that the Emergencies Act is what we call a law of last resort. It can only be used by the federal government if there are no other legal tools available to deal with a critical situation that's urgent, temporary, and national in scope. That is the criteria set out in the law itself. So I think it's really important to keep that threshold in mind when we talk about the witness's evidence. When any evidence is presented, it's important to ask if that evidence shows that there was a critical situation that was urgent, temporary, and national in scope, and if it could be dealt with under any existing law. So with that in mind, let me tell you about what happened today. And keep in mind, most of what I'm going to be telling you is just a summary of some of the pieces of the evidence that really stood out to me. It's not necessarily my opinion on that evidence unless I tell you it's my opinion, which I might do. I do have some thoughts about some of the evidence that was given. This is also only the evidence that I thought was something I wanted to focus on in this video. It's not a complete summary of everything that happened. If you want to know everything that happened, you can watch, 12 hours of commission hearings. Now, let's get to what happened. So as I said, there were 6 witnesses that were called. The first were 2 residents of Ottawa. The third and fourth were representatives of local Ottawa business improvement associations. And the 5th and 6th were 2 city councilors in Ottawa who represent the downtown wards that were most impacted by the Freedom Convoy protests. So let's talk about the first 2 witnesses who were these Ottawa residents. Their names were Victoria de la Ronde and Zexi Li. Ms. de la Ronde is a retired federal government employee. She lives in downtown Ottawa and is trained as a lawyer. She's also visually impaired and uses a guide cane. She gave evidence about how she was impacted by the Ottawa protests. And she talked about things like sleep deprivation caused by the constant noise of the trucks, the smell of diesel permeating her downtown apartment, and how she's actually lost hearing as a result of the continued noise of those trucks. She also talked about the psychological impacts of the convoy, including anxiety and the phantom honking that she has heard in her mind long after the actual honking had stopped. What really stood out to me about Ms. de la Ronde's testimony was the challenges that she faced as a visually impaired person during the convoy. Most notably, she had a lot of difficulty navigating the streets because a lot of the sound cues that she relies on, for example, the street crossing chimes, those couldn't be heard over the sound of the trucks. The trucks also blocked her usual routes for walking the streets, since many of them were parked on sidewalks. And that made it really difficult for her to leave her house to get groceries and medications because she couldn't navigate these streets. She actually said that she could not do it by herself, so she left accompanied by someone else. And keep in mind, Ms. de la Ronde lives alone, so this takes a lot of organizing on her part. Also, she pointed out that because of the street closures in downtown Ottawa, delivery of essential items that she had previously depended on were no longer available. I take Ms. de la Ronde's evidence at face value, and I believe her that her experience was incredibly challenging and caused her a lot of physical and mental stress. I also think it is so terrible and tragic that she lost some of her hearing, especially when she had already been living with a loss of vision. Honestly, this is just awful. I think it's so awful that she probably could even have a claim for civil damages. And I really don't want to minimize what her experience was like, but I do want to point out that this does not address the question of whether there was a critical situation that was urgent, temporary, and national in scope that couldn't be dealt with under any other law. And that is the important question to keep in mind in all of this. So while we can have a lot of sympathy for what Ms. de la Ronde lived with, it actually doesn't address that core question that the inquiry is designed to deal with. The commission also heard testimony from a young woman named Zexi Li. Ms. Li is 22 years old and was one of the plaintiffs in the class action that successfully obtained an injunction to get the trucks to stop honking. And there were some recordings of that honking, and it really is awful. It's really terrible. Like Ms. de la Ronde, Ms. Li gave evidence about the noise in her apartment from the trucks, as well as evidence of the conduct from some of the protesters, which she described as intimidating. She described the environment in the downtown area where she lived as lawless and reminiscent of the movie The Purge, which got into a bit of a back and forth when she was on cross-examination of, I guess, the plot line of The Purge, which I don't know if it was super relevant to spend a lot of time on, but I think there's some clips of that. I'll try to find one and link to it below. Ms. Li also downloaded a decibel reader. She gave evidence about downloading this decibel reader that showed the sound in her apartment was between 75 and 90 decibels. And the commission also presented evidence that on the street, the decibel readers, a different decibel reader that they gave evidence from had a reading of about 100 decibels. Ms. Li also spoke about how she felt the Ottawa police were the ones who were supposed to be protecting residents, and she felt like they were not doing that. She talked about how the police had actually investigated her building where she lives for an incident where some resident of her building had thrown eggs out a window at the protesters. And she expressed her frustration that the police were investigating the egg throwing, but had done nothing to remove the protesters from the streets. Now, like Ms. de la Ronde's evidence, I do not doubt that this was a very difficult time for Ms. Li and it took a big toll on her. But again, I ask the same question. Did this constitute a critical situation that is urgent, temporary, and national in scope that could not be dealt with under any other law in Canada? And in my opinion, our opinion at the CCF, the stress and disruption caused by the trucks did not meet that high legal threshold. Next, the commission called two representatives from different business improvement associations. Ms. Nathalie Carrier from the Vanier Business Improvement Association and Mr. Kevin McHale from the Spark Street Business Association. Both Ms. Carrier and Mr. Hale gave evidence about the impacts of the Freedom Convoy protests on local business. These were businesses that in Ontario had been closed down because of these severe public health restrictions in that province. The public health restrictions were actually on the brink of ending when the protests began, and this unfortunately required these businesses to remain closed when they ought to have been opening. So there's no doubt that this was a really devastating impact on these businesses. Ms. Carrier and Mr. McHale also expressed a lot of frustration that the police had not given enough advance information to local businesses and local business associations about the size and scale of the protests. Now, if I'm recalling this correctly, I believe there was evidence that the police had estimated that these protests, there would be about 3,000 protesters, and obviously there were significantly more than that. Ms. Carrier also expressed frustration that her local Ottawa police liaison was redeployed to work on the protests themselves, and she was assigned a lower seniority officer who couldn't address her concerns and the concerns of her member businesses effectively. To me, the most notable thing about the testimony from the business associations was their frustration with the police and bylaw for lack of enforcement of existing laws, which to me suggests that the problem was lack of enforcement or insufficient enforcement, not the lack of existing laws. And remember, the Emergencies Act is only available when existing laws are insufficient. Next, the commission called two Ottawa city councilors, Councilor Catherine McKenney and Councilor Mathieu Fleury. Their testimony began with a lot of focus on the geographic locations of the protests, as well as the description of the protests themselves. And again, this included some video evidence and audio evidence of the noise of the protests, which I totally agree was absolutely awful. The councillors gave evidence about the hostile behavior from some of the protesters, including evidence that an unidentified protester assaulted an unidentified homeless man in the Byward Market. Mr. Fleury also called the trucks themselves, to quote what he called them weapons. And he was questioned about this a lot on cross-examination by the lawyer representing the protesters. The examples that the city councilors gave of the hostile behavior from some of these protesters, that behavior is indefensible. And this includes evidence that some protesters pulled the masks off of people's faces. It included evidence that some protesters actually drove to Mr. Fleury's home and yelled at him and his family, and evidence of threatening messages sent to Councilor McKenney. This is awful and obviously completely unacceptable. However, there are, of course, existing laws that can be used to address that and should have been used to address that. I believe that Councillors Fleury and McKenney care a lot about their community and were doing their best to represent the residents of Ottawa who were most affected by these protests, and they were affected. There's no question about that. These councillors made a lot of effort, including an effort by Councillor Fleury to push the mayor to declare a local state of emergency, which, by the way, has very different implications from a federal declaration. It includes efforts by both councillors to increase bylaw fines for parking-related offenses and to place restrictions on idling. Councillor McKenney had also asked the Prime Minister to send RCMP to address the protests so that Ottawa police could be redeployed to residential areas, and she also brought a motion at Council to have additional police brought to Ottawa. But again, these are all existing laws. Indeed, what stood out to me the most about the testimony from these two councillors was not that the existing laws were insufficient, which is the legal standard. Rather, a lot of their frustration, in my opinion, seemed to come from the lack of enforcement or insufficient enforcement that took place in Ottawa's red zone, as well as a lack of resources, which again is why Councillor McKenney repeatedly asked for more resources. There was also in their testimony a lot of criticism of Chief of Police Slowly, in particular criticism that he had permitted trucks to enter the city to begin with. I hope that this summary has been useful and informative for you. It's hard to watch all of these hearings. They went on from 9:30 a.m. till after 7 p.m. at night. So I'm going to do my best to keep posting video summaries as I can, but that is only going to be as my regular workflow permits. And I do have a lot of workflow right now since we are a party to this inquiry. You can stay up to date by subscribing to this channel and also by signing up for our email freedom updates at theccf.ca/freedom updates. I also want to thank all of you who are helping us participate in this inquiry by donating to support our legal fees, which are really expensive. So if you want to support our work, we would so appreciate if you could help us by making a donation for our legal fees. If you can't, I totally get it. Please though, subscribe to this channel, like this channel. We are monetized on YouTube, so we do get a little bit of ad revenue. So sharing this video with your family and friends or giving it a like actually goes a long way. Okay, that's all for this update. Thanks for watching, and let's keep fighting for freedom in Canada.